Today I'm going to be talking about getting the native feel, that is, getting HTML5 apps to feel like native apps, and some issues that are related to that. I'm also going to be talking about the plugin that I wrote to manage touch events. And I'll also talk a little bit about hardware acceleration and JS optimization and some other further considerations when you're starting to think about getting your HTML5 app to feel just like a native app. Can everybody hear me in the back? Okay, great. So I want to talk at first about some context, which is a situation that I call I lose. In the I lose paradigm, we're forced into delivering content through an app store. And that's really expensive because each platform is its own project. And we have to pay part of our profits to another corporation, sometimes 30% of our profits. And we have to play by their rules. We spend 6 months building a project, and suddenly they say, no, that's actually not okay. We won't allow your app into our marketplace. So that's a big I lose. And also we lose control over distribution and our marketing. Because if our competitor has an app that's being promoted in the App Store and we are not being promoted in the App Store, there's nothing we can do about that. Someone else has control of that. This is not the web. This is not an even playing field. So that's a situation we want to get out of, ideally. So here's a company that did that, Financial Times. They have an HTML5 app that feels quite a bit like a native app and runs on Android, iPad, just about any touch device, launches from the home screen, and really raises the bar for what's possible. So it's certainly something to check out if you're thinking about doing this type of thing. It's built by a dev shop in London called Asanka, and they have a video about how they built it. The lead engineer from Asanka presented to the London Ajax user group, or meetup group, our kind of sister group in London, that is. And that's the video right there. So if you want to check out that video, that's really chock full of information about how they did it. The audio is a little rough, but just tolerate it. So they used a lot of HTML5 technologies and hacks to achieve this user experience. And one of the things they did was they prompted the user to save the app to the home screen. They really held the user's hand through that process, guided the user through that user flow, and they can get the user to bring that app to the home screen. And when the app goes to the home screen, it has a Financial Times icon, and the user can launch it from there. It loads very quickly, and the URL bar goes away. And so it feels a lot like a native app. In addition, they have really smooth animations, and at a certain point during registration, they prompt the user to expand the amount of local storage that the user will allow the app to have. So they take it all the way to the limit, to 50 megabytes, and that allows them to provide an offline experience for the user. So this is sort of like all really edgy stuff, in my opinion, and amazing. So things that we can learn a lot from. Last week, Financial Times was totally kicked out of the App Store for not sharing the full 30% with Apple. Financial Times' response is, okay, so what? We have an HTML5 app. Why don't we just direct our users there? And suddenly, that changes the playing field quite a bit. Apple has a lot less power suddenly in that relationship. And Financial Times has a lot more flexibility. They'd still like to be in the App Store, sure. Of course, but maybe they don't absolutely need to. Okay, what are we doing at Hop Studio? We're also developing HTML5 apps. My recent work has, which I can't directly talk about because it's all hecka stealthy and stuff, has been geared toward mobile and tablet. And but I was approaching these projects, and I was looking at some frameworks like Touchy and jQuery Mobile, and I was realizing there was kind of like, I have to play by the rules of the whole universe. Like, if I'm going to get into jQuery Mobile, there's going to be a lot of dictation over like what my UI is like and all that stuff. And that's not going to work for our designers here at Hot Studio because they're coming up with really creative stuff. And so that wasn't going to work. But what I really needed was just kind of control over what I call the touch environment. And I call it the touch environment because you've got a really limited amount of things that are going on when a finger hits the screen, right? But you're trying to extract from that a lot of intention, right? So the touch environment is like, it's like, for example, like if a finger's going across the screen, is that a drag or is that a swipe? Like, is the user trying to drag something around and pan something, or were they trying to turn the page, right? So I needed to be able to differentiate between that stuff. And eventually, I looked at some other JavaScript frameworks, but just nothing was working for me, so I wound up writing my own. And that's Touchy. Touchy, here's the GitHub address, is layered on top of OnTouch Start, OnTouch Move, and OnTouch End. So any browser that implements those events can use Touchy. Mostly that's WebKit, but there might be some other browsers that might implement that as well. So it's loosely based on iOS native gesture recognizers. So iOS has drag, swipe, pinch, rotate, and long press, and tap also as gesture recognizers. I didn't implement tap because I felt like that was readily available through Touch Start. But if there's a compelling use case and I get feedback on this, maybe I'll implement that too. But the architecture is based on Cowboy Ben Allman's jQuery special events article, which he wrote last year. And special events in jQuery are a kind of a real amazing little hidden corner of jQuery, where you can actually use bind and unbind on your own homespun events. And that's really cool, I think. So definitely check out Ben Allman's article if you want to learn more about the inner workings of how Touchy works, because it's really based on his architecture. The event handlers that you would write to handle events that are triggered by Touchy receive a number of parameters in addition to the jQuery event object. They receive, for one, they receive a phase of the event. And that's how we sort of figure out if we're in a drag, is this the start of the drag? Are we moving in the drag, or is this the end of the drag when the finger comes off the screen? And so you can imagine on your drag you would like touch the screen and the thing would highlight, right? But then on move you would want to like animate it, and then release you would want to take that highlighting away. So that's how we do that stuff. Here's some code. Example one is pinch to zoom, and what I'm doing here is I'm defining an event handler with handle touchy pinch, and then I'm going to bind that event handler. The events, as you can see, are all prefixed with the touchy name so that there's no name collision. Like, I didn't want to name an event drag, for example, because there's the HTML5 drag, right? And didn't want to have any collision there. So all the events in this plugin are prefixed with that name. And the parameters come into the event handler. We get the event, jQuery object, that is. And we get the jQuery wrapped target so that we're ready to act. We don't have to like wrap jQuery around this or something. And then we get data, which is a JSON object with lots of detail about what's going on. So, for example, scale is a property of data, and we can control our pinch to zoom through the scale property. The other thing, other properties that come into a pinch handler would be things like the center point between the two fingers, in case we want to like drag and pinch at the same time, right? Might need to know that information. All the different events fire kind of different things. I mean, they send different information in the drag object. So, and then there's second example, which is like a wheel interface, or like a turntable, or a knob, that kind of an interface. I'm handling that through handle touchy rotate. In this one, we have a phase coming in, so that we can know that are we in the start, are we in the move, or are we in the end. And I'll show that one to you right now. Just give me a moment. I'm going to have to switch stuff on the fly. see what we got here. So here's my, whoops. Hang on. That's right, my dongle's dangling. Let's see if we can get some recognition here. Yeah, okay, here we go. So here's our interface, and this artwork is graciously contributed by one of the principals here at Hot Studio. So I can do this, and I can just kind of like rotate this around, right? This is pretty nice, smooth animation. And this is a single finger touch as opposed to, some of you might be familiar with on gesture change, which requires 2 fingers to do a rotation. This can be configured to do 2 fingers by the developer, but I kind of think that single finger is a little bit more backwards compatible toward older versions of Android and stuff. So anyway, so let's talk a little bit about how that gets so smooth. Okay, let's leave Touchy behind right now, and let's talk about event handlers. Okay, we come back, hopefully, at some point. Hello? VGA? There we go. Okay, so so event handlers. The big rule here is if you're trying to like get some really great animations going that feel native, you should be using CSS3 3D transforms. That is the big step that we need to take. And we can spin that by affecting the style property of an element or using, CSS in jQuery or whatever. But the real hack here is to be using, if you have a 2D transform going on, to make it into a 3D transform by including translate Z or translate 3D as part of the transform description. You can just append your 2D transform with one of these, and it instantly becomes a 3D transform, and then you get hardware acceleration. Awesome. Now, what's hardware acceleration? Hardware acceleration is when you tell the CPU of the device to not do the animation. You tell it to offload that job to the GPU, the graphics processing unit, which is a specialist in doing that job, as opposed to a generalist. And it turns out that that makes all the difference, and you get really amazing effects. You can test to make sure that you have the correct hardware acceleration going on by launching a browser with these certain flags attached to it from the command line. And so if you launch, like, say, Chrome with these flags, or Safari, you can get sort of highlighting around these things if they're being hardware accelerated. What I have here is launching the iOS simulator from the command line to get this effect and to sort of like test, are my elements correctly being accelerated? So I want to try to show you what that looks like if I can. I'm going to have to move this over to the other screen if I can. Here we go. Whoa, okay. So it's a little large, but this is what it looks like. This is the iOS simulator, right? And then if we do this, that means, yes, it's being transformed, and it's by 3D, and we're getting hardware acceleration. Okay. So the other things you might want to keep in mind when you're writing your event handlers are throttling your frame rates. You want to make sure that your frame rates on any kind of animation are not occurring above 60 cycles per second. And they might even be able to be clocked down to like 30 frames a second, because that's where video is, right? But the refresh rate of the screen is at 60. So you certainly don't need to be above that. And if you do go above that, you can really start to bog things down. Let's say you do have a pinch to zoom events firing on trying to repaint the canvas, okay? So those touch move events on that pinch zoom are going to be firing like super fast, like and the problem there is going to be that that's going to fire faster than the animation can actually occur. So it's going to look all clunky and slow, and you're like, what's wrong with my animation? The trick is actually to slow down your animation. not speed it up, right? It looks like it's going too slow, but you actually want to slow down your animation so that it can be smooth and look fast. So it's totally counterintuitive, right? That's an important thing to keep in mind. You want to separate reading and modifying of DOM values into two distinct phases of operation. That means like if you're like reading like the left value of an element and then you want to change it over here, you don't want to go back and forth between like figuring out that left value and then affecting it and then going back and then doing this. You want to like do all your reads at one time and then do all your writes at one time, and that's going to be a lot more efficient for the browser. Also, when you're profiling, you can name, I'm going to take questions at the end. If you're profiling stuff in, say, like, you know, the inspector with Google Chrome or whatever, you can name anonymous functions and then they'll show up in the profiler. And a lot of people don't realize that you can, just in the same place that you put an anonymous function, you can actually write like function, you would normally write like function, parentheses, open brace, right? But you can just actually say function, my test name, parentheses, open brace, right there in the same place, and you can, then it'll show up in the profiler. So that can be useful. Things to avoid: DOM manipulation. Try to do as little DOM manipulation as possible. When you do it, hit it all at once. You probably already know this stuff, right? Do everything in a document fragment and then hit the DOM, right? Don't hit the DOM over and over and over and over and over again. Just do everything outside the DOM in a fragment, pop it in. Accidental browser layout reflow. This is when the browser is like measuring everything and trying to figure out like all the floats and all the relative positions and like where everything should go. You can trigger this accidentally really easily. Like just checking the offset width of any element on the page, boom, the whole browser's like, oh, I'm going to reflow the whole thing right now. And that's a big problem. So don't do that. Especially like inside of a loop. You want to do that really intentionally and intelligently. And a really great resource to learn about this stuff is actually Paul Irish's video that he published, I think, a few months ago about CSS3 and performance. And he lays out all the different things that will trigger this. There's some other resources too, but Paul's video is a great starting point. Animated CSS shadows and gradients. This is another thing that's going to really bog down the browser. They're really awesome, the fact that we can do shadows and gradients now with CSS. But if you try to animate that stuff, it's just a little bit too much. It's just too much for the browser because all those gradients are really like tough for the browser to draw. It's like really careful, like little stuff there, you know, in that gradient. And then if you try to animate on top of that, it's going to kill the browser. So you might want to have some conversations with your designers about like either we're gonna like not put some shadows around the stuff that we're going to animate, or we're going to maybe go back to some older methods of providing shadows, like image-based shadows. I had a shadow on the rotation one that I showed you, but that was okay because it wasn't actually moving, right? It was staying in one place in one size. As soon as you start like resizing that shadow, everything falls apart. Some example uses of JS and CSS3. HTML Rocks, awesome resource, totally great. There's tons of stuff there, and a lot of the stuff I'm talking about today, there's a lot more information about on that site. Desandro is a total master. He's like a Jedi. So check this guy out. He wrote this thing called Isotope, and it's this thing that animates the periodic table according to, you know, your different desire. And maybe some of you have seen it, but he also has a GitHub page where he like shows all these different examples of what's possible with CSS3 and animations and how to connect that to JavaScript, and really cool stuff. Very inspiring, lots to learn from. Then there's the Touchy examples. There's some examples on the GitHub page, and you can check those out if you'd like. There's not that many there, but there will be more in the future. Okay, so some further considerations with HTML5 apps. Base64 encoded images. This is something that Financial Times did with their images. So a Base64 image is is an image that's been translated into text, right? Usually that means that the file size is going to be increased to about like 130% or 150% of the original. It turns out that if you gzip that string, it returns to about the same size as the original image. So in addition, so that's cool, right? In addition, and then you can plug it into your application with a data URI, okay? So the data URI uses the base64 string, turns it back into an image. And the cool thing about this is that, okay, there's a couple of cool things. For one, you can put it all in a JSON object. And now you're doing one HTTP request to get all your images. Secondly, mobile providers like Verizon will like mess with images because they think, oh, here's a JPEG. I need to compress that a little bit more to optimize their bandwidth, right? But that's going to denigrate your images. So that's not what we want. And we're like, hey, I'm a developer. I know what I'm doing. This is what the image is supposed to look like, okay? Don't mess with it. So if you encode it as a base64, they can't tell the difference. That's pretty cool. So another thing is request animation frame. Paul's going to talk about that later, so I'm not going to talk about that right now, but that has to do with kind of the clocking thing I was talking about, with the refresh rate. And as far as offline use goes for the HTML5 apps, like I mentioned, saving to the home screen has a lot of benefits, especially on mobile, especially on iOS. And but if you couple that with a cache manifest file, a cache manifest is you declare an attribute inside of the HTML tag that directs the browser to a file, which is called the cache manifest. And that's a list of files that you want the browser to cache. And so the browser can launch the app without actually having to go to the internet. It has cached these things. And so the HTML5 app is going to like launch like that. So you do that for like the skeleton of your app, and then you have local storage to sort of like populate it, right? So now you are offline. You don't need the internet anymore, right? You've launched the whole app. You've got your content in local storage, you've got your cache manifest for your skeleton, bam. Last thing is W3 widgets, W3C widgets. This is like a zip file that's packaged up into a widget that any compliant client can launch kind of as a little app. And this just received a proposed recommendation from the W3C. But we'll see what happens to this in the future. This could be really cool, and this could just die. We'll see. Okay, for the win. Build and advocate for optimized HTML5 apps because they're better for business and they're better for developers and they're better for users in the end. Create and contribute to open source projects and make development easier. I mean, like when I'm talking about this stuff like the cache manifest file and stuff like that, it's like there's not a lot of frameworks out there that sort of are going to help you out with this stuff. So we kind of need to work together and build this stuff because this is how we're going to take HTML5 to that native level. And we're going to be able to be judged on the same grounds as native apps, and we're actually going to be able to be there alongside them. So I really want to encourage everybody to dream big and push the limits and really take it all the way that you can because we don't want an I lose situation, right? We want win-win for everybody. That's an open system, and open systems are going to win. Okay, so thanks everybody. Here's some links at the end of the talk, and if you download the PDF, those are all available to you. Again, that's the address. Okay, thanks.